Good afternoon. We should start this webinar. It's 1 o'clock. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Sarah Snabel. I'm going to be the presenter of the webinar today. Just a little bit of background information about pro ergonomics, because I know we have many of you are repeat viewers. I know that, and some of you are new. And so if you are not familiar with pro ergonomics, we are a team of certified ergonomists and registered kinesiologists, and we specialize in ergonomic assessments of all types. So it could be in all industries. We've got a variety of us on our team with kind of different specialties, from manufacturing and municipality and healthcare and, all of the different ones. I'm just, thinking of a few projects off the top of my head that we're working on right now. But yeah, that's a little bit of background information on us. www.proergonomics.ca is where you can always find more information. But we really strive to be professionals in our field and experts, really. So subject matter experts when it comes to ergonomics. So for today's webinar, we are going back to basics. It is Global Ergonomics Month, October, and this sort of inspired us to kind of, look at ergonomics and the definition of ergonomics, the foundation, the cornerstone pieces, what is it about, what is it that as an ergonomist that we kind of do as sort of a specialty, what's one of those things. And it's a PDA. Honestly, doing a PDA, a physical demands assessment, and doing it well is the cornerstone of ergonomics, right? If you can document postures, which is what a PDA is, it's a report or a document of what's physically required in a job. That is the cornerstone for doing a lot of, it's the foundation for doing a lot of other ergonomic assessments, being able to objectively collect data and present it in a way that is usable for the end user, right? And we'll talk about more about how a PDA is used. But today I want to talk about the accurately describing postures in a PDA and some of the key features. I kind of narrow this down to like the top 5 things or the top 5 key features or essential features that I would look for in a PDA. And then you could use the information today for either evaluating your current PDA. So what is it that you guys have in your workplace right now? Maybe you have nothing and you're looking at where to start. So you're like, what makes a good PDA? I've seen lots of templates out there. I'm not really sure where to start. How do I know which one's better than another, right? So that it could help, the information today could help you in that aspect. And it could also help you to tweak something that you currently have if you are doing them in-house or you're doing them yourself. And then it might also just help to kind of give you some ideas on, again, how you can use PDAs, right? So maybe you already have PDAs, maybe you think they're already really good, and just, other little things that you can build on with a PDA. So again, as I mentioned, my name is Sarah Snabel, registered kinesiologist and a certified professional ergonomist, and I'm also one of the co-owners of Pro Ergonomics. And my outline for today is very basic in the sense that I want to focus on those key features in a PDA, but at the very start, I want to just make sure that I define what is a PDA. I think that's important just to make sure that we're all on the same page and kind of talking about the key uses in a PDA, or how we would use them. Most often they're used for return to work. So a physical demands assessment is a PDA, right? That's the short form. It's objective documentation of the physical demands in a job. So I am documenting what is required to do the job. I want to know things like, how much do you sit? How much do you stand? I probably want to know an overview of the tasks that you do. Like, tell me about a sample in your day. And that's really what a PDA should be. It should be very similar, or sort of, I guess maybe we should say complementary to a job description. So your job description is all of the words of the responsibilities that you do. And then a PDA would be this complementary document to go with that would talk about what's required physically to do that. So your responsibility is to fill potholes, right? I mean, as an operator in the roads department, one of the tasks is filling potholes, but then a physical demands assessment is going to go through the physical elements on what's required to fill potholes, right? So the lifting, the reaching, the strength demands. That is what a physical demands assessment is. It is objective, right? It's going to be measurements of what's physically required. So again, not evaluating a particular person, but looking at what's required to do the job. Now, similarly, because we sort of use these terms almost interchangeably, especially these days, I think maybe if you had asked me this question about 10 years ago, I would have said I do a lot of PDAs, physical demands assessments, and now in 2020, we, especially in the last couple of years, we are doing a lot more JDAs. Now, a JDA is essentially the same thing, but it's also including some cognitive demands of the job. So all of the physical demands as per a PDA, but then, you would also call it a CDA, right? A cognitive demands assessment. So it's like JDA equals PDA plus CDA. And cognitive demands will go through things like memory requirements or deadline pressures, discussing some of the relationship elements that are important in a job. Again, not meant to assess a person, but documenting what's required of the job. I feel it's important to mention just PDA, JDA, because in some ways they are used interchangeably, but there's different information that is captured in each of those. And for the purpose of today's webinar, I'm choosing to just focus on the physical demands because if I also focus on cognitive demands, I could talk forever, right? So I'm just trying to capture just a very key piece here. So we're going with physical demands today, but know that capturing the cognitive demands is also something that is, again, important. Okay, so how do we use PDAs effectively? What are their common uses? Honestly, 9 times out of 10, they are probably going to be used for a return to work case, right? It could be an active case that's open. Maybe you have somebody who has been injured on the job and you're needing to send that JDA or PDA off to the WSIB. Right? Maybe that's something that has to get included, and you are describing to them what the job demands are, what the physical demands of the job are, and then they're kind of using that to determine, was it a workplace injury? Can they come back to work? There's so many different uses when it comes to that, right? But WSIB doctors, right? Physicians, who else have we sent them off to? We've seen physiotherapists or occupational therapists use them. So again, it's from the claims management side, it's mostly WSIB or insurance companies who are looking for that information. But the important thing to remember here is that when it's WSIB or insurance or anybody involved with a claims management, even within your own organization, you have your team of claims management folks or a team or person. Often that person doesn't necessarily know the ins and outs of the job, right? So that is always in the back of my mind when I'm doing a PDA, is that the person reading this PDA is not likely to know the details of the job, especially when it comes to terminology or different tasks. A job that's out in the field, for example, if you are somebody who works in an office, then you might not necessarily know all of the details, right? You might have an idea. So the PDA is also a snapshot of that job, right? It's documenting the physical demands, but kind of trying to give enlightenment to somebody who doesn't know the job well, trying to enlighten them on what that job is, right? To make them understand, especially when it comes to needing to do, they're talking about appeals or long-term disability decisions or whether or not the injury is work-related or not, right? So the PDA can be a very important document, not to be taken lightly, and we want to make sure that it's accurate and objective, right? Those are the key things, objective. I'll probably use that word 1,000 times today. But also in this return to work kind of thread, a PDA would also be used for accommodation purposes. So you could use it in a couple of different ways, right? So I'm working on a project right now where I've done the physical demands assessment of a certain position, and I have the client has hired me to look at the physical demands or the physical abilities or restrictions of an employee who is wanting to apply for that job. Okay, so I have to make sure that my document is thorough. I've got what's documented by, in this case, WSIB has provided these restrictions or these abilities, and I'm doing a job match. So I'm looking at what's required of the job, what can the employee do, and then again, kind of almost do it like in a chart form, right? Comparing, okay, well, this is what the job requires, this is what the employee can do. Is it a match or is it not a match? And if it is a match, you say that. And if it's not a match, then you're kind of looking for ways that you might be able to modify it and ultimately trying to make that decision on whether or not it can be modified. I would say that PDAs are used very heavily in that aspect, right? Like it's nice to be able to send off to WSIB, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. The next part then is accommodating your employee, right? So it's going to help to identify those opportunities for accommodation or modifications. So I might have a section in my PDA that documents strength and how much, they've got to lift these boxes from a pallet, right, on a skid or a pallet, right? And they've got to stack all the boxes onto the pallet, wrap them with shrink wrap. But maybe this restriction is that they can't lift over shoulder height, for example. That would be a common restriction I might see. And so just because the PDA says that they do have to lift over shoulder height, right? It says that they have to lift up to 60 inches. It creates this opportunity for discussion. Okay, well, yes, that's a requirement of the job, but what can we do about this particular task to help the employee? So it can help it's like that objective tool, right? I like to call it a tool in that case, right? So you put it on the table and it's a tool to help you have those discussions on where modifications need to happen, as opposed to not having that document and you're on the spot trying to think of all of the things that you might need to do to accommodate the employee, or not having that conversation at all, and the employee going out and re-injuring themselves. So it can be a very pivotal document in that sense. I also find that a PDA is being used, it can be used anyways, it kind of depends on what the process is or what step you're at in doing job descriptions. But again, I mentioned earlier that I say it's very complementary to a job description. There are some job descriptions that I've seen that might have like a physical effort heading, for example, and not all of them. And I'm not saying one way or another whether you should or you should not have that. That's just something I've seen in different job descriptions. But when I do see them in a job description, they are very, it's not common for them to have measurements. So it might say something very generic like must have the ability to lift up to 50 pounds, or it might say heavy lifting required, which is sort of my pet peeve because then we have not defined heavy, right? I said objective is important. And so I would just be careful when it comes to a job description is that, maybe you kind of keep it focused on the responsibilities and you leave the PDA to talk about the physical demands. And then if you are going to put something that's related to physical effort in your job description, that you have it, maybe you're pulling it directly from the physical demands assessment or just somewhere where it's justified and measured, right? So that you don't get yourself in sticky situations, saying that somebody has to lift up to 50 pounds when in fact, there's nothing heavier in the job than 30 pounds. And I say that as an example of an actual case I worked on where the job description said that. And then when we went through and measured everything, we could not find anything that was like heavier than 30 pounds. So it ended up being a modification or having to make a change or an update to the job description because we were asking for more than what was required, right, in the capability of somebody applying for the job. So you can use a PDA in lots of different ways. The difference really, this is an interesting question that I get a lot, right? I need you to come in and do a PDA. Okay. And you're going to tell me how to fix the job, right? Well, that's not really a PDA. So we need to remember that a PDA is a document that just describes what is required from a physical perspective, right? It is used in that disability management process. It's used for return to work. It will have very detailed information about what's required, like how often you lift something and the weights and postures and, sitting, standing, walking, driving, all of those elements, but it's not going to quantify the risk. It's not going to tell you, that this task of lifting is a high, moderate, or low risk to developing a musculoskeletal disorder. That would be a risk assessment. Now, a PDA can be the foundation in data collection for a risk assessment, but they are not the same thing. So a risk assessment would be using, again, very similar information. So the frequency that somebody has to lift and the different heights that they have to lift from. But I would be then kind of spinning that data and comparing it to standardized tools and guidelines to determine that risk of injury or the likelihood of developing an MSD. And then providing recommendations and control opportunities. So if I found that, lifting a box that's 40 pounds at a height of 40 to 50 inches right? That's what the PDA says, but it doesn't tell you if that's good, bad, or ugly, right? It just says that's what it is. A risk assessment is then going to tell you that, okay, well, based on the frequency that you do that lifting, you are at a high, moderate, or low risk of MSD injuries. And then it's going to tell you, or that's what we would work on, is telling you the controls, so ways that we think that you could fix it. So if it's that the box is heavy or that the box is too high, it's making suggestions on, what are those limits. However, it is very, 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 very important to know the difference between a PDA and a risk assessment. It's probably the most common conversation that we have when we're doing quotes, right? So if somebody calls and says, I need an ergonomic assessment. Well, an ergonomic assessment is very generic, and I would say 75% of the time they are probably looking for a PDA or JDA, right? Physical or cognitive demands assessment. Or they're looking for a risk assessment that other portion of the time. Right? But an ergonomic assessment is sort of this quote unquote blanket term that a lot of people use. And then when we get talking, we're trying to narrow it down. Well, what type of ergonomic assessment? And so these are kind of the two main categories that often get confused. I think it's important to clarify the difference between them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the actual PDA. So talking about the content, we know that it's going to cover the physical demands of the position. It's going to be a summary. It's going to be objective. So what are some of those key features in that PDA? So again, evaluating your own, or looking at developing something, or using this as a comparison on what your next steps are. Are you going to do it yourself? Or are you going to hire externally? What's going to happen? So the key features is that you should make sure that whatever PDA template you're using is going to be applicable for your work. Now, I say this because there are lots of different PDA templates out there. There are some that are really short, or they're a really quick read, right? Some of them you might be able to do in 2 pages. Some of them you might see that are 11 pages. So what's the difference, right? That is really the biggest question. What is the difference? Do we have enough information in the 2-page PDA? And do we have way too much information in the 11-page PDA? Or is it the same information and just presented differently, where we're skipping through a bunch of not applicable, not applicable, not applicable? I've seen so many different templates out there, that I think it's important that you just make sure that whatever data your template is covering, it works for your job. So for example, that 2-page PDA might work really well for an assembly line worker, somebody who is doing a shorter repetitive cycle. You might be able to get all of the detail that you need in 2 pages. Whereas if you were looking at a personal support worker, for example, so somebody working in the healthcare field, trying to document all of the physical demands of their job on 2 pages will be tight, because there's a lot more variability in their job. And you're trying to describe, well, what is it that they lift? The assembly line worker might lift the part and the tool, whereas the personal support worker is going to lift patient belongings and lift devices, and there's going to be some strength demands related to pushing of stretchers and wheelchairs. Your description becomes a lot longer. So sometimes you might want to just make sure that your template, your format, that it's going to work. Right? And then within that, once you decide on that, and I mean, it's possible also that, in your workplace, you've got jobs that are a mix, right? Maybe you have some that are really quick, repetitive cycle times and some that are a lot longer. But you do want to pick one form and use that consistently for all the jobs in your facility, right? That's just for simplicity, right? Again, and consistency. So making sure you pick a template and stick with it, but making sure that template really does work for the jobs that you have, and that each of the fields, and I say fields like each of the elements within there, that they're specific. So if you've got a lot of, maybe you want to describe the environment, right? In a physical demands assessment, it's very common to have a section that describes the physical environment. So do they work indoors or outdoors? What PPE do they have to wear? What type of terrain would they be most commonly working on? And maybe kind of a quick little summary of some of the safety hazards. And so you might want to have that in your PDA. Some people might not want that because they have a separate job hazard assessment done, right? And that's what they're referring to. So they don't need the PDA to include that. that would be a whole section, that environmental hazards section, that could or could not be included, that would be sort of customizable on your needs. Okay, so template. And then a good template should have a nice cover page. Here's the reality. Whether your document is 2 pages long or 11 pages long, most people who are reading it are going to be people who are not you. And what do I mean by that? Okay, so for example, I'm an ergonomist. I do ergonomics every day. I care a lot about ergonomics and the detail. I put a lot of effort into my report. But the reality is that the person who's reading my report, when it comes to a PDA, it's probably not going to read every single detail that I've written. It's there. All of that detail is there as reference, as kind of doing my due diligence that I've documented all. But they're likely not going to read 11 pages or 7 pages or 3 pages. Maybe they'll read 2 pages, but I'm going to tell you that a PDA in 2 pages is very uncommon and challenging. So you're going to want to make sure you've got a quality summary page. That summary page is going to be the first impression that somebody who is sort of a non-expert, right? Again, even if you are not the one, you're looking at all the nitty gritties, and somebody, is sending it to a doctor or the WSIB. How many forms do they get in a day? They're not going to sit there and read 7 or 11 pages. They might flip to the pertinent information, right? So if they're specifically looking at something related to the shoulder for this particular case, they're going to flip to the section on the shoulder. But a lot of the time, and we've just heard this feedback time and time again, I've been doing this for many years, is that most people just look for the summary. So that first impression on that summary page is very important. And it may or may not be the only page that somebody reads. And if it's done well, then it might help them to, again, flip to the exact section where they need more detail. So a cover page, a very typical cover page for a PDA that I would do or that our team would do, would have, the basic information: job title, department, the hours of work, the shift length, and any kind of shift rotation type of thing. So you kind of get that overview or that snapshot of how the job works, right? And it's also going to have maybe a few pictures. Oh, pictures are great. If you can get pictures in there, pictures say 1,000 words. And then essential duties. Now, you can call them essential duties, you can call them essential tasks, but essentially this would be a summary of how their day is broken out. So if it's an 8-hour day, what do they do for 8 hours? So how is it broken out? Do they do 2 hours on this task, 2 hours on this task, 2 hours on this task, and 2 hours on this task? Do they do all 8 hours sitting at a computer? Do they do and even within that, like let's say they do a 30-second cycle time within that 8-hour shift, we can probably break it down even more specific to know what percentage of their day is actually spent doing task A, B, C, D, right? So that cover page is really important in kind of giving the overview or the snapshot on the whole job. What else makes a good PDA? This is a very sort of high-level summary here, but having it clear, concise, and objective. And I mean, I can't say that word objective enough, but you really, 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 lots of reallys here, you want to avoid subjective wording. So a PDA, again, if done well, should not use words like heavy, fast, slow, without a definition, right? If you've got that defined, then, maybe I would let that with those wordings include in there. But really, it should just say, it should have measurements associated with it. So it's not heavy lifting required. It's lifting of boxes and bins and products up to 52.5 pounds, right? Maybe, I'm just picking 52.5, but whatever it is, right? But you're having the measurements and the weights in there, and you're having the heights and the reaches and the distances, but you're having measurements in there to define. You don't have to, as soon as you say heavy, I don't know, like, what do you guys think? When somebody says the word heavy, what number do you think of, right? I wonder if it's the same. What you think is heavy, is it what I think is heavy? And that's where it gets subjective, right? Heavy can mean something different to a lot of people And actually, this is sort of it's not really a game that I play, but it's it's so when I go on site and I'm doing assessments and I'm taking measurements, it's just, again, sometimes I grill people with questions, right? And I'm shadowing them, and and so just to kind of keep it interesting, I'll say, well, how much does that weigh? And they're like, oh, I'm not sure. And before we weigh it, I'll say, well, take a guess. And they might take a guess. Oh, I think it's like 30 pounds. And we put it on the scale and it's actually only 18 pounds. Or we put it on the scale and it's 50 pounds, right? That's common. It's common. So every once in a while you get somebody who's really good at guessing bang on. But the guesses sort of depend on the person. So I find that likely somebody who is a strong person, maybe I'm thinking like some of the larger males, they are likely to underestimate the weight. So you say, if they were to say something's heavy, they're probably thinking something's heavy when it's like 70 or more pounds. And then somebody who doesn't do a lot of lifting, or a much more petite person, is more likely to overestimate. So when you say something's heavy, they might be thinking, oh, well, that the box of paper is heavy. And when you weigh it, it's 50 pounds. And yeah, 50 pounds could be quite heavy. And they might think that, that's really heavy, and we weigh it and it's 35 pounds. So the definition of heavy, the definition of fast, slow, in a PDA, those words shouldn't be used. Not at all. There shouldn't be, it shouldn't be heavy, it shouldn't be fast. It should have measurements associated with it, and that's how you're keeping it objective. I would also say that a really good PDA has some quantifying, because if you are doing a job match, if you're getting anything from the WSIB that's suggesting that you need to restrictions, occasional lifting. Well, what does occasional mean? So that's all tied back to the NIOSH frequency data, 1 to 5%, 6 to 33%, as we have pictured here. So a PDA should have those. They should have something, right? Like, and that is quantifying how much they have to do the lifting, so that it actually makes it usable when you need to use it for a return to work. So this does not often, but this has been a couple of times where I've seen it, where there will be ranges or frequencies in a PDA, and they are not these percentages. They are something different, like 1 to 25%, 25 to 50%. So again, I don't know where those percentages are coming from, but I would check, especially if you've got some older PDAs or something, just check that your percentages do line up with the NIOSH. It will make it so much easier. If they don't line up with NIOSH, then I don't want to say that they're useless, but they're very challenging to use. And it's kind of hard to argue, like, well, where did those percentages come up from? So NIOSH is what I find anyways, is the WSIB uses the most often. Or any of those places where they're sending in employees restrictions, right? Occasional lifting, or avoid repetitive bending, and the occasional repetitive reflects back onto these percentages. Postural data. Okay, that is a physical demand assessment. Yeah, it's about strength and, sitting, standing, moving, but it has to include information on the postural data. And because that is ultimately, if you are using this for a return to work or an accommodation, it's probably going to talk about some limitations related to the back, the shoulder, the wrist. Those are probably the 3 most common that I can think of off the top of my head. In terms of, if I'm doing a job match or something like that, it's usually related to shoulder, back, wrist, sometimes knee, if we've got some bending, or, might relate to stairs. But you're going to want to make sure that your PDA includes all body parts, a full body assessment. So everywhere from neck, shoulder, like I know this is a snapshot from one of our PDA templates. So we include postures on neck, shoulder, elbow, or forearm, the wrist, the back, and the lower limb being like the knees. And then we would also have a section for feet, right? For example, to cover off like foot pedal controls. So ideally, you've got a PDA that's covering off all of those different postures, and then kind of documenting the movements within each of those, and not forgetting neutral, right? So there are going to be times when your body is in neutral. There'll be times when it's bending or twisting, and you're going to want to have those documented. What tasks require the wrist to be in flexion or extension? What tasks require the neck to be looking down, right, in flexion? and for how often. So that's where you're entering in your NIOSH frequencies as well. So you might say that, okay, well, it's about 20 seconds of every 30 seconds in our cycle time that the person is looking down because they're looking at the parts as they're installing on the line, right? So 20 out of 30, that's 66.6666%. That's a pretty constant. 67 to it'd fall in the range of 67 to 100% in those NIOSH frequencies, and that's what you'd want to have documented. Now, a good PDA also would break that down a little bit further. So, because what you might find is that, where's a good example? A good example is somebody who has to do a specific task or a specific demand for something that falls within the 6 to 33% range. So 6 to 33% out of an 8-hour shift, right, which is pretty average, could be anywhere from a half an hour to I think about 2.5 hours of time, right? If you do the math, right? 6% times 8 hours, 33% times 2 hours. But that's kind of a big difference when it comes to trying to accommodate somebody. And so you could have that maybe neck flexion is required for 6 to 33% of the time, but then having another column that kind of breaks it down to describe that the 6 to 33%, it occurs for 2 to 3 seconds intermittently, or it's static for 3 minutes of every 6 minutes. You're describing it in more detail, breaking it down to help describe to somebody else, especially in an accommodation perspective, breaking down and describing the demands of that job. And then having description as well. So description being, what is it that they're doing? Why do they have to be in neck flexion? Why do they have to be in neck extension or looking up? What are they reaching to? So shoulder flexion. What is it that they're reaching in front of their body to? You're going to include heights and reaches in there, like distances, again, to keep it objective. And you could also include range of motion in here. Now, sometimes range of motion can be a bit of a tricky one because, well, what happens if I'm watching somebody who is 5 feet do the job, and then I watch somebody who's 6 feet tall doing the job? And the range of motion that they're going to use for their shoulder is likely to be a little bit different. So that's where the measurements come into play, because then you're talking about, well, what's the shelf height that we actually need to, what's the shelf height that we need to reach to? And then range of motion is meant to be a generic range, right? So, for most people, it's going to be that it's up to 90 degrees, right? So it's going to be anywhere up to 90 degrees of shoulder flexion required. And you kind of just use that again to sort of paint the picture, but the measurements that are added in there are the most important part. Because let's say you're, in this return to work case, maybe you've got an employee who can't lift over shoulder height, right? It just says that can't lift over shoulder height. Well, to be specific to the employee, you would find out what their shoulder height is, right? Then you would look at the job demands, the physical demands assessment, and you'd be looking for things, right? If this document didn't say anywhere in here any of the shelving heights that they have to access, how would you know? And so, you would be looking for, okay, well, the employee's shoulder height is 53 inches. So you would go through the document and you'd look for any of the reaching or the lifting demands and find where there's things that are higher than 53 inches. And again, it becomes that conversation tool on how can we accommodate them? Can we accommodate them? And what can we do to accommodate them? So postural data is important, but also keeping it objective. And those are the ways that you keep it objective. So one is trying to make sure that you are describing it. You're giving a breakdown. You are including measurements and range of motions, again, trying to paint that picture for somebody who might not have any idea on that job. Maybe they've never seen it in action. And pictures. Pictures say 1,000 words. If you can include pictures in your document, oh, does it ever help? Especially relevant pictures. So if you could, it depends on the document. If you're trying to minimize the overall, if you're trying to minimize the overall length, maybe you just have pictures on the cover page. But I've got, one template right now, for example, that is, I think that's about, it's like 7 or 8 pages. And the reason why it's that long is because the client specifically asked for pictures. They wanted the pictures a certain size, and they wanted pictures at the top of every single page, just so that it made the document easier to read, and easier in the sense that they really wanted pictures to help describe the words. They thought that would be easier for everybody who'd be involved in reading it. So in that particular case, it makes the document a little bit longer, but again, pictures say 1,000 words, and that's really what they wanted. So big pictures across the top of every page. Those pictures can be smaller, but again, it's making sure the pictures are relevant. So especially if you're using terminology that maybe maybe not everybody knows. So if you're talking about a very specific piece of equipment, right? And maybe it's not a piece of equipment that everybody knows off the top of their head, having a picture of it and then even like labeling it, or at least having it on the page where you're talking about that equipment, that can really help to, again, paint that picture for the reader. It could be the physician, it could be insurance, it could be, anything along those lines, somebody who's reading it who really doesn't have an idea of the job. But again, pictures say 1,000 words. I think that it's worthwhile. And you can keep them generic too, like these are stock photos that are shown right here, but because we don't want to share client photos through here. But when we are sharing stuff for a client, I always ask for permission. So one, I tell people that I want to take pictures, like the client, whoever has hired me to come on site. And then I would speak with the individual employee that I'm shadowing as well, and just make sure that I do have their permission to take their pictures. Often what I find I do in a document is that I might like cover their face, for example. Like I might add like a little circle over the face to kind of keep it a little bit more generic, or depending on what the client wants, I may not do that. Or I might just try to take shots. Like I might even zoom in. If I'm talking about wrist postures, then my photo is likely to be a zoomed in photo, sort of showing what their wrists or their hands do for a particular task that requires that demand. But pictures can be super, super helpful. Okay, so in summary here, I want to just kind of recap, like, what is it that you have? What is it that you're working on? Like, is the PDA that you have, is it working for you? Is there something that you really like about the PDA that you have? Is there something that you really dislike about the PDA that you have? Or you've got nothing and you're looking for where to start? So this is kind of the summary. You want to make sure, again, if you're like kind of evaluating your current PDA, like a lot of people have PDAs already to start, maybe a few, or maybe you've got one or two because you've needed them for a case in the past, but just, check it out. Does it have a summary page? When you look at that document, is it easy to read? Can you easily find the information that you need when you need it for a return to work case, right? Is it up to date, right? That's another key feature. Right? You want something that is up to date. And in terms of how often, actually, this is a question I get often, is how often should I be updating my PDAs? And I would say just a good rule of thumb is every 3 years or as the job changes. Now, it doesn't have to be that you're redoing them every 3 years, but it's just a good practice, I think, to get into reviewing them. So, you do a PDA today, and then in 3 years, just kind of set it on your calendar that you're going to come back, you're going to revisit it. It could be just as simply looking at the PDA and going out and looking at the job and just saying, yeah, we haven't made any changes. The person still does the exact same demands. Or maybe the process has changed. Maybe the workstation has had a bit of a physical overhaul or moved locations, and then it just needs a quick tweak to make it a little bit to make it updated. So again, making sure that it's in a usable format for what you need, right? If you're using it mostly for return to work, does it have all of the elements that you need? Or are you finding that, oh shoot, they've asked for lifting again. And you're frustrated trying to find that information in your PDA. So if there's information that you're frequently getting, make sure that your PDA template displays that in a way that is usable for you. And then I can't stress it enough that the PDA should be objective. It should be quantifying the job, right? Avoiding words like that could be interpreted, right? Like heavy, light, fast, slow. Those are just a couple of good examples. And making sure that they've got measurements in there instead. You may or may not want to include cognitive demands, right? That again depends on the job. I find that more often than not, we are including cognitive demands now. And that's again talking about things like supervisory responsibilities, deadline pressures, but again, in a way that I'm not evaluating the person ever, never evaluating the person, but documenting what's required. So tell me about the timelines that you have to meet. What happens if you don't meet them? Who sets those timelines, right? So that could be an element that you want to include as well. And at the time of setting up your template, you'd want to decide if you're going to include cognitive demands or not, just again, to keep it standardized throughout your organization. And then pictures, right? Do you have pictures? When you read the document, do you know what's going on, right? If it's a job that you haven't seen, because if it's a job that you know, you're likely to make assumptions as you're reading. You're likely to make assumptions because you're like, yep, I know, I know, I know. But when you send it to somebody who doesn't know the job, making sure that they're going to be clear on the information that's presented. Okay. Any questions? Sorry, I get really talking, and so I'm going to check the question bar because I'm on solo today doing the webinar. I haven't been able to check the questions as going, so 1 second here. Oops. I'm just going to make it bigger so I can read it. Oh, okay. So here's a question: Do you record shift information gathered from the worker themselves? Sometimes what's on paper is different from practice. Yeah, good question. I like to use a variety of resources when I do a physical demands assessment or a job demands assessment. So before I go on site, my preference is to review documentation that you might have on the job. And so that would include something like a job description or a task summary or standard operating procedure, just something that kind of gives me that overview. And then I would ask the employee that information when on site. If I ever felt that the information wasn't really a match, I would be validating with the supervisor or manager or potentially HR, health and safety, whoever has hired me to come on site. But again, making sure that's part of what makes a document objective as well is having it reviewed. And I didn't particularly talk about that, but this is absolutely what I would do is that for example, a shift information might be that they work 8:30 to 4:30 Monday to Friday with 2 15-minute breaks and a 30-minute lunch, right? That would be a very standard shift. But the reality is that that's what's documented on paper, right? But the reality is that people take an hour lunch and they don't take 15-minute breaks, or they take a few little 15-minute breaks kind of on the fly. And so what I might do is document it as per the job description, like what's on paper, and then in brackets or as a little side note, just describing that, breaks may be taken in smaller chunks, or breaks are not formally scheduled, or, something along those lines that still kind of captures what the employees are doing. But again, usually talking with my client to make sure that I'm documenting that in a way that is generic enough that it applies to the job. Whereas, especially if it was like a unionized position or something like that, I wouldn't want to document something that isn't accurate, that causes contention or argument. If you include cognitive demands into a PDA, doesn't that turn it into a JDA? Absolutely. So it does, right? PDA plus CDA equals JDA. So just depending, I tried to focus mostly on physical demands today and not talk a lot about cognitive demands. But if you were to include cognitive demands, I would absolutely call it a job demands assessment. I think it's a more all-encompassing term. There are some PDAs that I see out there that are titled PDAs, and they will have like a few elements, like our basic PDA template, one that doesn't have a detailed cognitive demands section, will still have some sensory demands in there. It'll talk about, hearing or speaking demands and just a little bit of those communication aspects, near vision or depth perception. It might have a few comments on that. But I've also seen some PDAs, I've seen a variety of PDAs, right, where they might talk on some cognitive demands assessment and it's essentially titled a physical demands assessment. So, I mean, you could really title it whatever you want. It's not like we own the term job demands assessment or physical demands assessment or cognitive demands assessment. But in general, a physical demands assessment would only talk about physical demands, and cognitive would talk about cognitive, and then a job demands assessment would be the all-encompassing of combining them all together. Question: is the job demands assessment, is the JDA the same as a job hazard analysis or a job safety analysis? Good question, and no, they are not the same thing. So they can be used complementary again, and sometimes because some of the information is the same, but a JDA would be the physical and cognitive demand. So documenting what's physically required, but there would be no element of identifying level of risk or likelihood of the exposure happening, right? Everything that's in a job demands assessment or a physical demands assessment is kind of under that MSD category. And when you do a job safety analysis or a job hazard analysis, you're talking about a lot more beyond that, right? Ergonomics or MSD hazards would just be one of those safety hazards that you'd be identifying in a job. Other things would be like sharps, explosions, fire, run over, falling from above. I'm thinking about all those little icons, right? And usually they're done in a chart form. So it kind of has some task steps, and it would say, what are the safety hazards that you are exposed to on this job? What's the likelihood of them happening? And what are the controls? And so a PDA could feed some of the information there, right? It might help you to identify some of the lifting. I mean, I guess menu material handling could be a hazard, but they're not the same thing. Because a PDA just is very much focused on the ergonomic elements. You're welcome. They go hand in hand quite nicely though. Like often how I would break down a PDA would be how you would break down a JHA, right? So you're creating a list of all of the JHAs that you want to do, and that would probably line up, for the most part, it lines up nicely with how you'd want to do PDAs as well, because you're kind of doing them by task. Any other questions? If you're typing in your questions, I'm still around. I want to just wrap up here with an offer, because we are going to offer anybody who's watching the webinar today. I'm going to send it an email after the fact here, actually. So to everybody who's registered for the webinar, I'll send you an email. One, I'll send you a link that'll have the recording here so that you'll have a quick, easy link if you want to watch it again. But also, if you're looking at doing PDAs and you're looking at doing them with somebody like us, a certified professional ergonomist, we have an offer up until December 18th for 10% off your first PDA. So if you're looking to get started, you're wanting some help, by all means, reach out to us. And that's an offer that we've got for 2020. And I'll include information in that email on how you can redeem that. And then you can always contact us for some additional information. Okay. And I'm seeing another question. It was helpful. Thank you. You're welcome. You like the way I linked job demands with the PDA. I find that that's actually really helpful. There's a big project that I'm working on right now, actually, and their job demands line up nicely with the PDA. They have a couple of sections on there. Like they do have a physical effort section, and then they have a supervisory section and an impact of error section. And the way they kind of have their job description broken down feeds nicely into the PDA. And then what I've been finding is that they've been creating some new job descriptions and updating some old ones, and they're actually using information from the PDA as well to help populate those new ones. So together over this 2-year project, we've been sort of working hand in hand, going back and forth. It's been working really nicely, actually. Okay, thank you guys so much for attending today. We are back on track with regular webinars. We've got November set up, again, MSD prevention program. So is it working for you? And my colleague Jen is going to be presenting next month. And so she's got this kind of set out that we're going to be talking about a prevention program. What do you have in place? And so it can be, again, this webinar will help you to evaluate what do you have in place? Does it need some tweaks? Or maybe even just giving you some ideas on where to get started, right? Not necessarily about reinventing the wheel, but tweaking what you've already got in place and making sure that it fits into systems or programs that you already have in place. And then we also have our December webinar posted as well. That's going to be my other colleague, Alex Stinson. She's going to be presenting on some key things to look for going into 2021. So 2020 has been quite the year. And so I don't know, has ergonomics been on the back burner for you, or have you maybe had more time to focus on it? And either way, she's been coming up with a list of some things that she's going to be helping to give some direction on going into 2021. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Again, stay tuned for that email that I'm going to send you after the webinar today about that offer and also with the recording. And we'll see you next month.